Have you ever wondered what the worst punishment in human history was?
Huh?
Today, getting caught breaking the law usually means a fine, community service, or prison time. But go back a few hundred or even a few thousand years, and the consequences could be far more terrifying. Throughout history, different civilizations created punishments not only to penalize criminals, but also to frighten everyone watching. Some methods were meant to force confessions, while others were public spectacles designed to send a clear message: don't even think about it. In today's countdown, we are ranking 10 of the most brutal punishments ever recorded in history. This list is based on historical evidence, the level of suffering involved, and their impact on society. Some are well documented, while others are still debated by historians, but all of them reveal just how different justice once looked. Let's begin with number 10, the rack. At first glance, the rack doesn't look particularly frightening. It resembles a large wooden bed with ropes attached to each end. Unfortunately, this was one bed you definitely didn't want to book a night in. The rack was one of the best-known torture devices used in medieval Europe and later in several other parts of the world. Unlike many punishments on this list, its main purpose wasn't execution, it was extracting confessions. The victim's wrists and ankles were tied to ropes connected to rotating rollers. As the executioner slowly turned the handles, the ropes tightened, stretching the body farther and farther. At first, this caused intense pain, as muscles and tendons were pulled beyond their normal limits. If the torture continued, joints such as the shoulders and hips could dislocate, and severe injuries could occur. Authorities believed that unbearable pain would force people to reveal the truth. The problem? Pain doesn't know who's guilty and who's innocent. Many suspects confessed simply to make the torture stop, even if they had committed no crime at all. Historians today often point to the rack as evidence that torture is an unreliable way to obtain information. Over time, as legal systems became more focused on evidence and fair trials, torture devices like the rack gradually disappeared from official use across Europe. Looking back at it today, it's hard to believe people called this part of the justice system. Safe to say, this wasn't the kind of stretching exercise your doctor would recommend. That was number 10, a punishment designed to force confessions. But our next entry had a different purpose. It wasn't about making someone talk. It was about making sure everyone else never forgot what they had seen. Number 9, breaking wheel. Imagine standing in a crowded town square during the Middle Ages. A large wooden wheel is placed in the center, and people gather from all around. This wasn't entertainment, it was meant to be a warning. Known as the breaking wheel or Catherine wheel, this punishment was used across parts of Europe from the Middle Ages into the 18th century. It was usually reserved for people convicted of particularly serious crimes, such as murder or armed robbery. The execution began by tying the condemned person to the ground or over a wooden frame. An executioner then used a heavy iron bar or hammer to strike specific parts of the body, often starting with the arms and legs. In many cases, the goal was to shatter the bones rather than kill the person immediately. Afterward, the broken body was often woven through the spokes of a large wooden wheel, which was then raised on a pole for public display. Depending on how the sentence was carried out, death could come quickly, or it could take many painful hours. As brutal as it sounds, the punishment served another purpose: fear. Authorities wanted everyone passing through the town to see exactly what happened to those who committed serious crimes. It was medieval Europe's version of saying, "Please read the consequences carefully." Fortunately, changing ideas about justice and human rights eventually led most European countries to abolish punishments like the breaking wheel during the 18th and 19th centuries. Looking at it today, it's hard to imagine calling this justice. It certainly wasn't the kind of wheel anyone hoped to spin. Number 8, flaying. Most punishments end with a person's life. Flaying was different because the suffering itself was often the punishment. Flaying is the act of removing a person's skin, either partially or completely. Historical records describe it being used in several ancient civilizations, including the Neo-Assyrian Empire and later in some other parts of the world. It was typically reserved for enemies, rebels, or people accused of especially serious offenses. Ancient inscriptions and artwork from the Neo-Assyrian Empire even depict flaying as a warning to anyone thinking of rebelling. The message was simple: challenge the ruler and face a punishment no one would forget. Because human skin contains millions of nerve endings, removing it causes extreme pain and severe blood loss. Even if the victim survived the initial procedure, the body became highly vulnerable to shock and infection. In many cases, death followed soon afterward. To make the warning even more powerful, some rulers reportedly displayed the removed skin on city walls or public buildings. It was a grim form of psychological warfare meant to discourage future rebellions. Modern historians believe these public displays were intended to project absolute power rather than deliver justice as we understand it today. Thankfully, we've moved on from this chapter of history. These days, the worst thing hanging on a government building is usually a parking notice, and most of us would happily keep it that way. So far, we've seen punishments designed to intimidate entire cities. But from this point on, the methods become even more disturbing. The next punishment became one of the most recognizable execution methods in history, and unlike many on this list, almost everyone has heard of it, even if they don't know how brutal it really was. Number 7. Crucifixion. Few punishments in history are as well known as crucifixion. While it's most famously associated with the execution of Jesus of Nazareth, the method was used for centuries by several ancient civilizations before being adopted and widely practiced by the Roman Empire. Crucifixion was usually reserved for slaves, rebels, pirates, and those considered enemies of the state. It wasn't just an execution, it was a public display meant to humiliate the victim and discourage anyone thinking about committing a similar crime. After being sentenced, the condemned person was often forced to carry part of the wooden cross to the execution site. There, they were either tied or nailed to the cross before it was raised upright for everyone to see. What made crucifixion especially cruel wasn't how it started, it was how long it could last. Depending on the circumstances, victims could remain alive for many hours or even several days. Death usually resulted from a combination of exhaustion, dehydration, shock, blood loss, and eventually the inability to breathe properly. The Romans carefully chose busy roads and city entrances for many crucifixions, so as many people as possible would witness the consequences. It was their way of saying, "Don't test the empire." Needless to say, this wasn't exactly the kind of roadside attraction anyone wanted to stop and admire. By the 4th century AD, after Emperor Constantine the Great embraced Christianity, crucifixion was gradually abolished within the Roman Empire, ending one of history's most infamous forms of execution. Number 6. Sawing. If you think cutting wood is difficult, history found a far more horrifying use for a saw. Execution by sawing appears in historical records from different cultures across Europe and Asia, although it was relatively rare compared to other punishments on this list. Because of that, historians believe it was never a common method of execution, but there is enough evidence to show it was used. In many accounts, the condemned person was suspended upside down before the execution began. This position wasn't chosen by accident. Being upside down allowed blood to continue flowing to the brain for longer, which may have delayed unconsciousness during the early stages. The executioners then used a large saw to cut through the body. Historical descriptions vary, and not every account agrees on the exact procedure, but they all point to an exceptionally painful and prolonged death. Unlike punishments intended to force confessions, sawing was purely an execution. It demonstrated the authority of those in power and served as a terrifying warning to anyone watching. Fortunately, methods like this disappeared as legal systems gradually moved away from public executions and increasingly emphasized more humane standards of justice. Looking back, it's hard not to wonder who first looked at a woodworking tool and thought, "I have a terrible idea." Thankfully, history eventually decided that was indeed a terrible idea. We've officially reached the halfway point. Everything you've heard so far was horrifying enough, but the top 5 punishments take cruelty to another level. These weren't just executions, they were carefully designed to maximize suffering and leave a lasting impression on everyone who witnessed them. And number 5 might be one of the most infamous punishments ever carried out in medieval England. Number 5. Drawing and quartering. Our next punishment sounds confusing just from the name alone. Drawing and quartering almost sounds like an art class gone terribly wrong. Unfortunately, it was anything but. This was one of the harshest punishments ever used in medieval and early modern England. It was reserved almost exclusively for high treason, crimes such as attempting to overthrow the king or betraying the crown. The government wanted the punishment to send one clear message: betrayal would come with the most severe consequences imaginable. The sentence was carried out in several stages. First, the condemned person was drawn, meaning they were tied to a wooden hurdle or sled and dragged by a horse through the streets to the place of execution. This public procession exposed the prisoner to crowds before the punishment even began. Next came the hanging. However, unlike a normal execution, the prisoner was often cut down before death occurred. Historical accounts describe the remaining stages as involving further mutilation before the execution ended with beheading. Finally, the body was divided into 4 parts known as quartering, and the remains were sometimes displayed in different locations across the kingdom as a warning to others. As disturbing as it sounds, public display was one of the main goals. The authorities wanted everyone traveling through major towns to see the consequences of treason. Thankfully, England gradually abandoned punishments of this kind as legal reforms took place during the 18th and 19th centuries. Today, the phrase "making an example of someone" has a much less terrifying meaning, and let's all agree that's a very good thing. Number 4. Impalement. If there were an award for one of history's most feared execution methods, impalement would unfortunately be a strong contender. Impalement has been recorded in several ancient and medieval civilizations, but it became especially infamous through the rule of Vlad III, better known as Vlad the Impaler, the 15th century ruler of Wallachia. Although he didn't invent the punishment, historical sources describe him using it extensively against enemies and invading armies. The method involved forcing a sharpened wooden stake through the victim's body. Contrary to what many movies show, experienced executioners often tried to avoid immediately fatal organs. Their goal was not a quick death, but a slow one. Victims could remain alive for many hours, and in some cases even longer, depending on how the execution was carried out. Rows of impaled bodies were sometimes left standing outside cities or battlefields, creating an overwhelming display meant to terrify anyone approaching. According to several historical accounts, entire armies reportedly hesitated after seeing these gruesome displays. Whether every detail is accurate is debated, but historians agree that impalement became one of the defining symbols of psychological warfare during Vlad's reign. It's difficult to imagine the fear such scenes must have created. Compared to that, a "keep out" sign suddenly seems incredibly polite. Today, impalement is remembered as one of history's most brutal execution methods, and as a reminder of how fear itself was once used as a weapon. We've reached the top 3. From this point forward, the punishments become even more disturbing. One of them was carried out in Imperial China and is supported by detailed historical records, while another comes from ancient Persia and is so horrifying that some historians still debate whether the ancient descriptions were exaggerated. Let's continue. Number 3. The Brazen Bull. Imagine being told your execution would take place inside a giant bronze statue shaped like a bull. It sounds like something from a fantasy movie, but according to ancient accounts, this was one of the most terrifying execution devices ever described.
The Brazen Bull is said to have been created in ancient Greece by a metalworker named Perillus of Athens, who presented it as a gift to the tyrant Phalaris of Agricans in the 6th century BC. The device was completely hollow, with a small door on one side just large enough for a person to fit inside. Once the victim was locked in, a fire was lit beneath the bronze bull. As the metal gradually heated up, the temperature inside became unbearable. Ancient writers claimed the victim would slowly roast to death while trapped in the enclosed chamber. But the most disturbing part wasn't the heat, it was the design itself. According to the stories, the bill contained a system of tubes and openings that transformed the victim's screams into sounds resembling the bellowing of a real animal. Instead of hearing cries for help, people outside supposedly heard what sounded like an angry animal. Whoever came up with that idea clearly wasn't applying for Inventor of the Year. One famous legend even claims that after Perillus demonstrated his invention, Phalaris ordered the inventor himself to climb inside to test it. Perillus was reportedly pulled out before dying, only to be executed shortly afterwards. Whether that story is true remains uncertain, but it's become one of the most famous tales surrounding the Brazen Bull. If the ancient accounts are accurate, the Brazen Bull wasn't just an execution, it was designed to turn suffering into a public spectacle, making it one of history's most infamous punishment devices.
Number 2. Scaphism. If you thought the Brazen Bull was horrifying, the next punishment didn't rely on fire or blades. Instead, it relied on nature. Known as Scaphism, this punishment is believed to have originated in ancient Persia and is often described as one of the slowest and most agonizing execution methods ever recorded. The victim was placed between two small boats, or, according to some accounts, inside two hollowed-out tree trunks, with only their head, hands, and feet left exposed. They were then force-fed large amounts of milk and honey, even if they refused to eat. Now, you might be thinking, milk and honey, that doesn't sound too bad. Well, that's because the worst part was still coming. The unusual diet caused severe diarrhea, covering the victim and the inside of the boat. More honey was spread across the exposed skin, attracting flies and other insects almost immediately. Left floating on a pond or marsh, the helpless victim became an easy target for insects, which fed, laid eggs, and multiplied over time. Unable to escape, the victim slowly weakened from dehydration, infection, starvation, and exposure. Ancient accounts claim the process could last for several days before death finally came. Modern historians still debate whether these descriptions were exaggerated by ancient writers. Even so, Scaphism has earned a reputation as one of the most horrifying punishments ever described in historical literature. Let's just say, after hearing this, mosquitoes suddenly don't seem quite as annoying anymore. We finally reached number 1. Every punishment on this list was designed to inflict pain, but the final entry stands apart because it prolonged suffering with deliberate precision, making death neither quick nor immediate. It remains one of the most infamous execution methods ever documented in history. Let's reveal number 1. Number 1. Lingchi, death by 1,000 cuts. Topping our list is Lingchi, a punishment that many historians consider one of the cruelest execution methods ever officially practiced. Lingchi, often translated as death by 1,000 cuts, was used in imperial China for several centuries before finally being abolished in 1905. It was generally reserved for the most serious crimes, including treason, the murder of family members, and other offenses considered especially grave. Despite its name, the punishment didn't literally involve 1,000 cuts. The phrase was symbolic, referring to a slow and prolonged death carried out through multiple cuts to the body. The exact procedure varied throughout history and across different regions. Historical records show that the executioner would make a series of cuts before the execution was ultimately completed. In some periods, substances such as opium may have been given beforehand, though historians continue to debate how common that practice actually was.
Unlike many punishments on this list, Lingchi is exceptionally well documented. Written records, official documents, eyewitness accounts, and even early photographs from the final years of its use confirm that it was a real judicial punishment. But Lingchi wasn't intended only to end a person's life. In traditional Chinese law, the body was considered something inherited from one's parents and should remain intact after death whenever possible. Lingchi therefore carried an additional layer of punishment by deliberately dismembering the body, making it not only physically painful but also deeply symbolic within the cultural beliefs of the time. Looking back, it's difficult to imagine a legal system allowing such a punishment. Thankfully, ideas about justice continued to evolve, and in 1905, Lingchi was officially abolished, bringing an end to one of history's most feared execution methods. If there's one thing this countdown proves, it's that humans have always been capable of incredible creativity. Unfortunately, not all of it was used for good. And those were 10 of the most brutal punishments ever recorded in human history. From stretching victims on the rack to the terrifying stories of the Brazen Bull to the slow suffering of Scaphism and Lingchi, these punishments reveal a side of history that's difficult to imagine today. What's perhaps most surprising isn't just how cruel these methods were, it's that many of them were completely legal at the time. They reflected the beliefs, fears, and justice systems of the societies that created them. Fortunately, many countries have spent centuries reforming their legal systems, replacing torture and public executions with laws built around evidence, fair trials, and human rights. While today's justice systems are far from perfect, history reminds us how much progress has been made. So, which punishment shocked you the most? Was it the psychological terror of the breaking wheel, the legendary Brazen Bull, or the slow agony of Lingchi? Let us know your answer in the comments. If you enjoyed this journey into history, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into the strangest and most fascinating stories from the past. Until next time, stay curious, and thanks for watching.